Alright, welcome to the oak openings of Northwest Ohio. The dominant community that we see here is oak savanna. There are different communities that shape up oak savanna. We'll get into those kinds of details more later. But what's important here to understand, and this is going to be the set of the course, or the course of the course, I guess, of course, is that we are looking at our backyards, human-created landscapes, but we're also looking at these more natural landscapes to understand how ecological communities work. And the videos that I'm going to shoot are going to be the rare things. They are largely a group of ecosystems that are rare in that the communities that have formed on them are limited in their distribution to begin with, as well as human fragmentation, manipulation have made them even more rare. Okay, so in the oak openings, the big thing here is the sand. All right, you can see the sand over here. I don't know why this was removed. And then further into the back, you can see more of what we call black oak Barrens community. And we'll go into that in better detail. But what's important to understand is everywhere that you look, I could turn into this overgrown forest behind us here. Everything has sand under it. Okay? How did the sand get here? Sand is a relic of the last glacial maximum. So as the glacier is retreating, water is held in place. Michigan, the glacier is off of some of Michigan. The ground, the moraines up there begin to erode into this lake. The lake's called Lake Warren. It existed until 16,000 years ago. Then it drained catastrophically as the glacier pulls back. You reach new drainage levels. And in that lake, Lake Warren, a big sand spit formed from the Detroit area all the way down to Bowling Green. It makes a big fish hook. Maumee River is after all this. It cuts its way through it. Okay, it fragmented off what exists over in Wood County, but it's all part of this oak savanna complex. Okay, savanna is representative of a number of trees. The tree density that you see, the savanna, so prairie is 16 or less per hectare. That's 2.5 acres. 16 or less trees per hectare. Savanna is 16 to 32. Oak woodland, which we'll look at in the background there, is 32 to 64. And then you start moving towards a closed canopy forest, and we'll take a look at that as well. But what's important here is the sand. The sand does some funny things. When I pulled this core out of the ground, this was very cool. Why? Because it has water stored in it, and that helps balance the temperature, which has allowed certain species to persist here since the time we had boreal forest here, right? So the glacier's pulling away. It's not just leaving water and sand and sediment and all this stuff, but it's also leaving behind species. Boreal forest pulls out of here. It gets hot. The maximum heat, so this is the glacial interval, all right, is at 5,000 years ago. That's the hottest. We're at that temperature now. During that time period, prairie invades from the west, goes all the way over to Pennsylvania, and then it gets cool and wet, cooler and wetter again, and then it goes back out to Iowa and Illinois. And you have the southern communities come up, southern hardwood communities come up. And this is made, I like to call it the intersection of greatness. That's what Lucas County is. Lucas County doesn't care about what you think about community structure, doesn't care about what you think a species is. It is all mixed right here in Toledo, Ohio. And it's left there, all right? Because I talked about the cool with the boreal, but it gets pretty darn hot out here, all right? And that's allowed a lot of that prairie community to persist. As well, sand doesn't hold nitrogen very well, doesn't hold phosphorus, doesn't hold water very well, okay? And so that shapes the community that's on top of it. And when the geology is holding a community that's different than the predominant community of the area. So Ohio is eastern woodland forest in a biome sense, all right? These are continental scale ecosystem organization. When it's holding something that's different than the predominant climate, we call that an edaphic process, E-D-A-P-H-I-C. You're going to see that across your screen. That's where the soils, or the geology, the underlying geology is, or hydrology, is creating a situation that is holding a community that's different from a different biome, essentially, in place outside of what would normally be there. And you're very lucky to have this right here in Toledo, Ohio. Yeah, totally sucks you're not in Trinidad right now. Totally sucks that you're not in the Blue Ridge looking at snot otters and all kinds of fish having their fun. But this is right here in your backyard, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Another element of that are edges. All right, we've already looked at some of this in Blackboard. In the discussion group, we're focused on edges. There are lots of edges around. There's a lot of human edges. But I want to show you some that are more natural, and some, like this one right here, right behind me, globally rare. This is a G2, so a G is a global ranking, a 2 is imperiled, and that's 20 or less occurrences. We go over to Irwin Prairie where it's a G1, that's 5 or less occurrences globally for that community system. Okay, but keep focused on that. You're looking at the common in your backyards, and what we're gonna look at is the rare out here. And in Lucas County, the big one is the sand. So this is Black Oak Barren, G2, 20 or less occurrences left. This ecosystem occurs Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio. I don't know if it's in Pennsylvania. Chris Tracy, help us out there. And New York, all right, and Ontario. It's characterized by these sandy soils, and the overstory are typically black oaks. We're losing a lot of our black oaks in here right now. You saw some deadheads in the last scene. Those have been hit by oak wilt. There are some different things going on, but you saw a lot of organic matter in that last core, and this is far more typical. Hit a root. Far more typical. Almost no organic matter whatsoever, and that's where this community thrives. It needs this disturbance. Here's the interesting thing about this place. This is a sand quarry. This used to be just a big sand plain. There weren't any dunes. These aren't dunes. These are piles. Okay, and that's important to understand. We have a rare opportunity here in the oak openings to just hard reset ecosystems when we're doing our management and obtain the maximum benefit and push the ecosystem to its earliest successional state. All right, this is primary succession. Who's succeeding here? We've got the lupin all over around me. We've got blueberries on the edges. It's starting to build organic matter, so I'll take a core out of here. This is right next door. And you've got a little bit more organic matter forming. The orange in the sand is rust. Okay, there's iron in there. When we get into the wetland soils, you'll see that the soil is gray, or the sand is gray. It doesn't have any oxygen in it. Puts the iron into a reduced state. Okay, so this is oxidized. These little gradients are what create the biodiversity. Here you have an endpoint. Okay, It's rare in the state of Ohio. Why is it rare in the state of Ohio? Because we don't have that much sand in the state of Ohio. Okay, you have more of this habitat in Michigan. And we've got a lot of components that you would see in Michigan. Okay, but the big take home here, when you're looking at this scene right here, is that this is a completely human generated landscape. There's probably 30 state listed species in here. We'll look at some of them. The lupin's one of them. It's potentially threatened. They're all over in here. Why? Because of sand and because of limitations. There's limited water, there's limited organic matter, there's limited nitrogen as a result. So we dump nitrogen on this, we turn it into the rest of Ohio. And that's another key concept that we'll be hitting over and over and over through this week. This is turning into one of the nicest savannas that we have through management. Okay, part of that is fire. This is had a fire, I believe, a year ago. It was spring of 2019. It looks like they did follow-up mowing here last year. But you can start to see we're loosening up the density of trees. This was an oak woodland. If you can see the extra green over there, that's all Eurasian garbage. Different invasive species are filling this all in. The first time I walked this 20 years ago, I mean, this whole thing was filled with invasive species. There's been a lot of work done on this. Fire, mowing, herbicide treatments to knock back woody succession. Part of the reason that the understory grows in is that it sat without disturbance as well, and we don't realize this when we're talking about acid rain. We're depositing nitrogen. It's like fertilizing your lawn, and that extra fertility that we have that's coming from combusting fossil fuels, right? There's nitrous oxides that come off of that, as well as evolving off of our farm fields. We're over applying nitrogen. You hear a lot about phosphorus, but don't touch that golden lamb. Oh man, do not touch the lamb calf. Who gives a crap? Don't touch it. They don't want to talk about nitrogen, and it's just as much a problem as the phosphorus is. Okay, but you can see this open plant form. Some of these trees have been killed by the oak wilt. Those trees at this point are more alive than they were. Well, maybe once they hit the ground. They'll be more alive dead than when they were standing, because of all the other organisms that are going to be able to utilize those places. A lot of our birds that are having trouble are grassland birds. Okay, so this may not necessarily be the ecosystem that they're looking at, but the cavity nesters certainly will benefit from having these types of environments available to them. As you're going through this, it goes back and forth. There's some blue lupin over there, just like what we saw in the Barrens, not as thick, and starting to work itself out of production. It's adding nitrogen to the soil, and we'll talk about that when we're looking right at a lupin. It's going to be way more interesting. But here you can see what we're talking about. We're talking about savanna, and mind you, this is still probably oak woodland. Okay, there's a higher density of trees through any given hectare of this, 2.5 acres, than what you would see in a savanna. But with the fire management and with different perturbances that go through, storms come through here. What if we had a tornado come through here? Awesome, knock it down. Okay, and then let it regenerate. And those are some of the things that are interesting about these systems, is what is regeneration? And those are big questions that we have to answer as ecologists, and maybe we'll get into a discussion about that on the discussion board. Alright, so we're kind of starting to zoom in here. And what are we looking at? We're looking at lupin. Look at those big radial leaves. Okay, so we're talking about these guys here. Flowers are just starting to come out. They're kind of dry here. I've seen better patches and photos from other places. We'll get you some more amped up lupin to look at. But what you can notice here is that even though there's more organic matter, okay, there's a little more organic matter, it's still pretty dry right here. And this is probably a rut running right through here. There's some other specialties in here. I see some June grass. Okay, so this is potentially threatened. June grass, I believe, is state endangered. We'll hunt that down. So even though we're out in this more open woodland, you have these little patches. It goes back and forth, and that's what's important, are these edges within the continuum. The oak openings, oak savanna is not really one community. It's a conglomeration of communities. And that's important to understand. If you don't have any edges running through your forest, you're not going to have the biodiversity. You've got a completely different soil here. Let's see what it looks like. Why not? Shits and giggles time. Let's see what it looks like below. Yeah, look at that. Okay, and that's not going to be all that bare sand that we see out in the Barrens, but you can see more organic matter and then going to that oxidized sand, which means it gets wet and then it gets dry. Okay, so you've got these little edges running all through the savanna. We could go over here and it would be a little more organic matter. That's important because that's a totally different community. That's what I love about the oak openings. If I get bored, I just walk over there. Here's another edge, a spin out. This is a tire spin out. Got some soil. Let's see how this works. You can see over here the leftover soil that was ripped up. And there's still some things left in here, but man, did this lupin like this here. For this site, this is probably the most amped up stuff I've seen yet. I've got some that are pretty open out in the Barrens itself. We'll take a look at that. But starting to get a better idea of how this succession happens. So this here is your classic lupin Barrens scenario. Picture big sand dunes along a beach. That's kind of what you got here. And people will tell you, oh, you know, don't want to go out there and disturb nature. I'm standing on where the lupins grow. And this is habitat for the federally endangered Carner blue. I'm not stepping on any lupins though, don't worry. But what's maintaining this? I'll tell you what's maintaining it. This is an animal trail. We don't like to think of it that way, but this is an animal trail. These ATV trails, man, lupin loves it. They're right on these edges. There's no competition. They're a legume. They're in the pea family. So they have a symbiosis with bacteria that infects their roots. I'm not going to dig one up and show you. I'll pull up a clover to show you that somewhere else. But they have that interaction with those bacteria that allows them to fix nitrogen out of the air into the soil. In the savanna, we're in full sun out here. This is Barrens as Barrens gets. You start to work yourself into a hole if you put too much nitrogen in the ground. And then as you get shaded out by competitors that you're helping to facilitate, you need some way to get yourself back into shape. And that's what we call the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Okay, that is that a certain amount of infrequent but moderate disturbances are necessary to maintain optimal biodiversity because it creates those edges. Otherwise, everything turns into the same thing. Okay, do we want a bunch of ATVs running around out here? I don't know. Probably not, because they don't do it intermediately. You've probably been hearing gunshots, so everybody's out exercising their Second Amendment rights today. Because Ohio's starting to be open again, so why not shoot our guns instead of showing them to everybody? But that's what's going on here. Okay, remember, this is a quarry. And we're going to look at some other quarries too over the course of the week. But what a beautiful thing to look at. I'll zoom in on these guys for you. We'll start looking at some of the individuals that make up these things, the more interesting species that are easy to film. But hopefully you're getting a picture of that whole continuum. We've gone across a whole bunch of different soils in this dry sand that creates an edaphic process that allows these species that you'd see up in mountains or different climatic scenarios further out west that are able to deal with the low nitrogen, low amounts of water. Before I hop out of here though, and before I forget, let's talk about the crust. Okay, and this is part of that successional community. These are different cyanobacteria, bacteria, fungus, all kinds of things. Every kingdom of life is in this piece of soil right here. This is a piece of soil, believe it or not. It's holding these sand grains together. It's called a cryptobiotic crust. And I bet if I drop some water on it, which I forgot to bring, this moss right here would green up about instantly. Very adapted to dealing with this type of thing. The less ATVs and horses that run through here, the more this can form, the more soil begins to form, the more these processes take place, and the more the lupin can ultimately be run out of business if we don't have disturbances come through. Now, historically, that had been fire. Native Americans, Indians, were lighting fires too. So what's natural? I'm not really sure. And I'm pretty sure that I tend to want to manage for optimal biodiversity and resilience rather than some checkpoint when a white guy jumped off of a boat on a new continent. I think that's the dumbest thing to manage towards. It's about maintaining this biodiversity at scale, not boxing things into little postcard-sized preserves. And these trails right here just speak to that whole notion. Humans are just a part of the environment as this lupin or this crust or anything else. We're all in this together. Question is, will we be with it for longer? Don't know. Ugh. So we've got a line here, and the difference on either side is the type of management that's gone into place. On this side, we've got that active quarry, Now we're doing management, brush management, we're doing fuel reduction, we're doing organic matter reduction because we don't have as many trees, or they're dying from getting the oak wilt. That's really changed the amounts of inputs that are coming into this ecosystem. On this side, our management is nothing. We're not doing anything. Okay? But we are. We are preventing intermediate disturbance from maintaining this G2 ecosystem. It's the same soil on both sides of the line, although that's becoming some other kind of novel soil and novel ecosystem for this type of edaphic geology that would shape something different if we weren't adding in so much nitrogen and keeping it disturbance free. Got a killdeer over here. He's really interrupting my thoughts. This is like a bad kid in class. Keep talking. Anyway, but that's a choice. That's a choice. Doing nothing's a choice. Doing something is a choice. I've watched doing nothing, and what that turns into is a lot of something I don't want. This is largely dominated by maples. That's why it's so greened out. They green up before the oaks do. That's a part of the requirement of maples, is that they need that extra nitrogen to do what they're doing. They start to mine phosphorus too. They change the whole soil. These are native trees, but on this soil, I mean, there's plenty of clay soils through the rest of the state to build this kind of forest, and one that would be a lot more robust. These woodland ephemerals, they're just not. They're not as striking as other places where you see those beech maple associations. But that's the deal. There's a line right here, and its management. The same soil goes through the whole thing for now, but we make choices about that management and what is going to carry forward. So it's something else to be filming prickly pear cactus through a chain link fence into a junkyard. That's what this is. Because these soils weren't productive agriculturally, because they don't hold nitrogen, they don't hold water, don't hold organic matter. It was at the time that people were trying to do things out here. That's changed now, of course. But a lot of junkyards out here, you know. What are you going to put on that sand? Oh, store junky cars. This is actually a pretty good junkyard. And it's good to reuse these things. But I think this scene is kind of one of the more interesting things to think about. A lot of biodiversity has persisted in these junkyards on the margins. They put a lot of stone and fill and things like that, and very disturbed soils. But it intrigues me to wonder if, with some management, you know, we've got some knapweed off to the left, we've got common buckthorn off to the right. If we couldn't manage these back into something, and by manage I mean rehabilitate. You're not going to restore things in this sense, but we may be able to get more ecological complexity out of this, should this site ever go away. So this is a roundabout that we're maintaining as an Oak Barrens community. County engineers asked us to do this a few years ago. This is, we've got 2 of these on Door Street. This is the more successful one, and a lot of that has to do with the soils that we received. In this one, we were able to get more sandy soil. I asked for sand. People say, oh, you can't grow things in sand. Things don't grow in sand. And I couldn't get them to believe me at Door and King. And we've had to do an awful lot of maintenance there to get that ecosystem, and now we're going through an ecosystem change. We're going to change the community that's there to something that'll better tolerate the type of soil that was delivered there, because it was more rich, and the more rich it is, the more nutrients are in it. We didn't want that. We wanted literally bare sand. Super easy to plant in, globally rare community. This is a G2 community too. We've created those soils here in the middle of roundabout, and I think that's pretty stinking cool. Kind of ugly right now, and that's one of the disadvantages to native plantings, but once we get to summer and the 500 butterfly milkweed that are in here pop up, this thing will be, as y'all say, lit. That's what it'll be. So soils matter. We can create, we can construct ecosystems. We've been able to demonstrate that here in the middle of this roundabout. And just think what we can do with all this space that we have around here, with the soils that are already in place. If we thought about it a little differently and didn't feel the need to mow everything within a millimeter of its life. So yeah, Door and Centennial, Door and King will look different. And it's kind of fun to see how each one is a little different, what we need to tweak. There's even microclimates within this roundabout. Over here, that's the northeast corner, is the wettest. The southwest is the driest. It gets the heat of the late day. It's blowing in. This is the most moist, the most protected. We see this out in the other ecosystems as well, in the more natural ecosystems. I think it's a fascinating little playground to mess with. So think about that too. How would you incorporate these elements into your landscape?